Before the world learned to fear the name Geronimo, he was known by another name, Goyawa, the one who yawns, a quiet name for a quiet man. He was not born a warrior, not raised to command, not shaped by dreams of blood or conquest. He was born Apache, and that was enough. In the years before the gunfire came, life moved to the rhythm of the land. The Bedonko Apache did not measure time in dates or borders, but in seasons, shadows, and stories passed beside the fire. Children chased each other through the dust. Women ground corn and sang songs older than memory. Men hunted, traded, and watched the horizon, not in fear, but in respect. The land was harsh, but it was honest. It took only what it gave back. Goyai was a husband, a father, a man whose hands were shaped more by work than by war. He laughed softly. He listened more than he spoke. Those who knew him did not see a future legend. They saw a man rooted in his people, bound to his family, at peace within the fragile balance of Apache life. That peace did not last. In 1851, while Goyawe and other men were away trading, soldiers from Mexico rode into the Apache camp. There was no warning, no declaration, no battle between warriors. Only fire, steel, and screams where laughter had been. When Goyawe returned, the camp was silent. The wind carried the smell of smoke and blood across the earth. The fire pits were cold. The songs were gone. Where his home once stood, there were only broken shapes, bodies left where they fell, lives ended without honor or reason. His mother, his wife, his children, slaughtered not in war, but in absence. Goyawe did not cry out. He did not fall to his knees. He stood among the dead, his shadow stretching across the ground as the sun sank low, and something inside him closed forever, not hardened, not enraged, emptied. That night, the Apache elders spoke of spirits and balance, of mourning and time. Goyawe said nothing. But in the silence between breaths, a truth took shape, clear, unavoidable, and merciless. Peace had abandoned him. From that moment forward, the world would no longer see him as Goyawe. The man who yawned at the slow passing of days was gone. In his place stood someone forged by loss, not driven by hatred alone, but by a vow deeper than revenge. Never again. Never again would his people be unprotected. Never again would his land be taken without a price. Never again would Apache blood be spilled while the world looked away. This was not the birth of a killer. It was the awakening of a defender. The Apache did not choose war. War came to them, carried on horses, wrapped in uniforms, armed with laws written far away. Borders drawn across sacred ground. Promises broken before the ink dried. Soldiers who called themselves civilized and brought destruction in its name. Goyawe learned quickly. He learned that treaties could vanish, that mercy was rarely returned. That survival demanded vigilance. The land itself became his teacher, the deserts of Sonora, where the sun burned skin, and patience alike. The mountains that hid past only Apache eyes could see. The nights so cold they stripped weakness from the bones. He learned to move without sound, to read the earth like a story written in dust and stone, to disappear where others left trails of desperation behind them. Where armies marched in lines, he moved like water. Where soldiers searched maps, he followed instinct. To the Apache, these were not tricks. They were traditions. Knowledge passed down through generations who had survived long before uniforms and flags arrived. Goyawe did not master the land. He listened to it. As his reputation grew, whispers followed him, stories that bullets bent away from his body, that spirits walked beside him, that death itself hesitated when his shadow crossed the ground. Geronimo, they began to call him, a name given by enemies who cried in fear when he struck and vanished again. The Apache did not see a ghost. They saw a man who refused to abandon them. Geronimo did not seek command. He was not crowned, not elected, not declared chief by ceremony. He led because he stayed when others could not. Because he walked last when the people retreated. Because he never asked another to risk what he would not risk himself. He did not promise victory. He promised survival. When soldiers advanced with overwhelming force, Geronimo did not answer with blind rage. He chose when to strike and when to fade back into the wilderness. His fights were not battles meant to be remembered by historians. They were moments meant to keep children alive one more night. The Apache followed him because he understood what the Empire did not, that freedom was not an idea to be debated. It was breath, land, memory. Without it, life continued only in name. As the pressure closed in, as forts rose and reservations tightened their grip, Geronimo stood where the old ways still held meaning. To surrender was not merely to lay down arms. It was to surrender identity, language, spirit. It was to watch a people fade into something unrecognizable. Geronimo refused, not because he believed he could defeat an empire. He knew better, but because resistance itself mattered. Because each step taken in defiance reminded the world that the Apache were not shadows to be erased. To his people, Geronimo was not reckless. He was necessary. He carried the weight of that necessity without ceremony, without pride. Every loss carved deeper lines into his face. Every victory came at a cost he understood too well. Yet still he stood, rooted like the mountains themselves, unyielding not out of arrogance, but out of duty. Freedom, he believed, was not something to be handed down by conquerors. It was something defended, even when the odds made defense seem futile. If freedom was worth dying for, Geronimo was willing to die last. And as word of his defiance spread, as the Apache held on longer than anyone thought possible, the world beyond the desert began to change how it spoke his name. To his people, he was the last defender of Apache freedom. To the nation pressing in from all sides, he would soon become something else entirely. A problem, a symbol, a man who refused to disappear. And the hunt for Geronimo had only just begun. Long before soldiers learned to fear Geronimo, the land had already tested him. The Sonoran Desert was not a place of mercy. It did not reward strength alone, nor did it forgive mistakes. It punished impatience, arrogance, and noise. Men who arrived believing they would conquer it often died whispering apologies to the sun. To the Apache, the desert was not an enemy. It was a living force, harsh, honest, and demanding. It took life without hatred and gave survival without pity. Geronimo understood this truth in his bones. He did not fight the land. He moved with it. Where others saw emptiness, he saw instruction. He learned how stone held heat through the night, how shadows shifted with the hours, how the wind erased tracks as quickly as fear erased courage. He learned which plants hid water, which animals knew when storms were coming, and which paths existed only for those who had walked them since childhood. The desert stripped away everything unnecessary. It left only what mattered. For the soldiers who pursued him, the land was a nightmare. Canteens emptied faster than plans. Boots cracked under the heat. Horses collapsed. Maps lied. Lines of supplies stretched thin and snapped without warning. They marched in formation through a world that despised straight lines. Geronimo never marched. He waited. He listened. He let the land slow his enemies before he ever revealed himself. When he moved, it was with purpose, never to conquer ground, only to pass through it without being claimed. To the Apache, survival was not heroism. It was responsibility. Geronimo did not fight every day. He did not seek battle for its own sake. Often, he chose not to strike at all. He understood that endurance was a weapon greater than any rifle. Every day his people lived free was a victory no report could measure. Stories followed him like dust in the wind. Men swore they fired at him from close range and missed. Others claimed they saw him vanish into bare rock where no hiding place existed. Some said he walked untouched through gunfire. Soldiers whispered that bullets avoided him, that spirits guided his steps. The Apache did not argue these stories. They understood them differently. Geronimo was not protected by magic. He was protected by discipline, patience, and a lifetime of listening to the land. He was never where the enemy expected him to be. Never where fear dictated he should run. He chose ground that favored survival, not spectacle. When he struck, It was sudden and precise. A moment of chaos, then silence. No pursuit, no trophies, only distance. Geronimo taught his followers the same lessons. Move light. Leave nothing behind. Never fight a battle you do not need to win. Never take a life you cannot justify. War, to him, was not glory. It was necessity. The Apache camp shifted like living things. Fires burned low. Children were taught silence before speech. Elders watched the horizon while stories were told in whispers. Every step was measured. Every decision weighed against the cost it would bring tomorrow. Geronimo carried that weight quietly. He was not cruel. He was cautious. He did not celebrate violence. He understood it as a language forced upon him, one spoken by those who believed power gave permission. The American frontier pushed inward, relentless and confident. Forts rose where trails once ran free. Soldiers spoke of order, of law, of destiny. They brought numbers, weapons, and certainty. What they lacked was understanding. They believed the desert could be controlled. Geronimo knew it could not. Time and again, the army believed they had him cornered. Reports were written, commands issued, celebrations prepared. And then, nothing. Tracks vanished. Camps were empty. The desert swallowed him whole. Each failure deepened his legend. To his people, Geronimo became proof that the old ways still mattered. That knowledge passed from ancestor to child could still defy the machines of empire. That survival itself was an act of resistance. He was not invincible. He bled. He lost friends. He watched his people grow thinner with each passing season. Every escape came at a cost. Every winter took its toll. Yet still, he endured. Because surrender meant something worse than death. Reservation life offered food and safety at the price of identity. It demanded silence instead of language, obedience instead of tradition. It offered survival without dignity. To Geronimo, that was not life. So he chose the land instead. He chose hunger over submission, danger over erasure. He chose to teach his children that freedom was not an abstract idea, but a way of moving through the world, alert, proud, unbroken. When soldiers cursed his name, when newspapers painted him as a savage ghost haunting the frontier, Geronimo did not respond. He did not need to. The land answered for him. Each failed pursuit weakened the illusion of control. Each month he remained free proved something the empire refused to admit, that there were places power could not reach and people it could not easily reshape. Geronimo did not claim to fight for all Apache. He never spoke in grand declarations. He fought for those who followed him, for the memory of what had been taken, and for the right to exist without permission. The desert shaped him into something the world struggled to define. Not a general, not a king, not a criminal, a survivor. And as the frontier tightened its grip, as the hunt grew larger and more desperate, the name Geronimo traveled farther than his footsteps ever could. To his people, he was still the man who listened to the land. To the nation hunting him, he was becoming something else entirely. A symbol of defiance carved into stone and sand. A reminder that freedom, once learned, could not be easily forgotten. And the land that had raised him was not finished teaching yet. Geronimo never asked men to follow him. He never stood before the Apache and promised victory, riches, or glory. He offered no speeches meant to stir pride or anger. When he spoke, it was quietly. When he moved, it was with purpose. And yet, when he rose to leave the reservation, when he turned his face back toward the desert, people followed. Not because he commanded them, but because they trusted him. Among the Apache, leadership was not granted by title alone. It was earned through action, through restraint, through the willingness to carry the heaviest burden without complaint. Geronimo carried that burden every day. He was not a chief chosen by counsel. He was a war leader shaped by necessity. In moments of danger, when choices narrowed to survival or surrender, it was Geronimo who stepped forward, not to demand obedience, but to accept responsibility. The Apache watched him closely. They saw that he never placed himself above others. He ate last. He walked at the rear when the people moved, watching for signs of pursuit. When someone fell behind, he slowed the group rather than abandon them. When food was scarce, he shared what little he had without ceremony. These were not gestures meant to be remembered. They were habits born of conviction. Geronimo understood that every decision carried a cost. Every raid risked retaliation. Every escape left traces that could one day be followed. He did not take lives lightly, and he did not waste them carelessly. Violence to him was a tool, dangerous, imperfect, and never clean. He taught his people to strike only when necessary, to withdraw before anger took control, to remember that survival tomorrow mattered more than vengeance today. This discipline set him apart. Other war leaders had risen and fallen on the frontier, driven by rage or pride. They burned bright and were extinguished quickly. Geronimo endured because he understood something deeper, that a people could not survive on fury alone. Among the Apache, stories were told in the long hours after sunset. Stories of hunts, of ancestors, of lessons learned the hard way. Over time, Geronimo became part of those stories, not as a flawless hero, but as a man who chose wisely when wisdom was rare. Parents pointed him out to their children not to inspire fear, but respect. Elders spoke of his patience, of his ability to wait while others rushed toward disaster. Warriors listened when he spoke, because they knew he would not waste their lives to prove his courage. When Geronimo planned an attack, it was never for spectacle. He chose moments that would protect the people, disrupting supply lines, driving soldiers away from water sources, reminding the enemy that the land did not belong to them alone. And when the moment passed, he vanished again. To the Apache, this was not cowardice. It was survival refined into principle. The bond between Geronimo and those who followed him was not forged in victory, but in hardship. They endured hunger together. They buried their dead together. They carried children through mountains where even soldiers hesitated to follow. Every mile walked in silence strengthened that bond. They knew the cost of following him. They knew that each escape narrowed their future, that the army's patience was thinning, that surrender one day might seem inevitable. And yet, they chose the uncertainty of freedom over the certainty of erasure. Because Geronimo did not promise them safety, he promised them dignity. He reminded them who they were. Not prisoners waiting for rations, not relics of a fading world, but Apache, shaped by land, bound by memory, alive in resistance. When fear crept in, as it always did, Geronimo did not dismiss it. He acknowledged it. He spoke of the danger honestly, without false comfort. That honesty built trust stronger than any vow. He told them that survival did not mean the absence of fear. It meant moving despite it. In moments when soldiers closed in, when the desert seemed too vast and hope too thin, it was Geronimo who steadied the group. Not with speeches, but with calm. He watched the land. He waited for the moment when danger shifted, when a path opened where none seemed possible. And when they moved together. To the outside world, these moments were invisible. Newspapers saw only raids and escapes, names listed in reports, numbers reduced to statistics. They did not see the choices made in darkness, the arguments whispered between breaths, the weight of deciding who could continue and who must be carried. Geronimo saw it all. He carried the guilt of every loss, even when there was no better option. He carried the knowledge that each decision shaped not only the present, but the memory his people would inherit. That weight bent him, but it did not break him. The Apache followed Geronimo because he did not pretend to be invincible. He did not claim divine right or destiny. He claimed responsibility, and that was enough. To his people, he became a living answer to a question they asked every day. How long could they remain who they were in a world determined to change them? As long as Geronimo stood, the answer remained uncertain, and that uncertainty mattered. Freedom, in his hands, was not romantic. It was hard, costly, and fragile, but it was real. It was felt in every step taken without permission, every night spent under open sky, every choice made without orders from distant voices. To the Apache, Geronimo was not merely a warrior. He was proof that their way of life still had defenders, that courage could exist without cruelty, that resistance could be measured not by how many enemies fell, but by how many people lived on. And as his legend grew among his own people, it grew in another way beyond them. Because the same qualities that made Geronimo a hero to the Apache made him something else to those who sought control. A man who could not be bought, a leader who would not bend, a symbol that refused to disappear. And soon, the nation pressing inward would decide that such a man could no longer be tolerated. To his people, Geronimo was still the one who walked last, who guarded the retreat, who chose survival over surrender. To the empire watching from afar, he was becoming a threat that demanded a response. And the distance between hero and hunted was beginning to close. By the time the American army decided Geronimo could no longer be ignored, he was no longer just a man moving through the desert. He was an idea, and ideas were far harder to contain. To the Apache who followed him, Geronimo was still the same leader who chose silence over spectacle, patience over pride. But beyond the desert, in forts and government offices, his name carried a different weight. It appeared in reports, in telegrams, in conversations spoken with clenched jaws. He was described as a threat to order, an obstacle to progress, a symbol of defiance that refused to fade. The empire did not fear his numbers. It feared his persistence. Geronimo commanded no army. He led no nation recognized by law. At most, a few dozen Apache men, women, and children moved with him, hungry, exhausted, and relentlessly pursued. And yet, his continued freedom exposed a dangerous truth, that the frontier was not as controlled as it appeared on paper. So the response grew. More soldiers were dispatched. More resources were committed. Cavalry units rode day and night, tracking rumors and footprints that vanished as soon as they appeared. Scouts were hired. Borders were crossed. Orders were issued with increasing urgency. The pursuit of Geronimo became one of the largest and most expensive military operations ever directed at a single indigenous leader. Thousands were sent to hunt dozens. The soldiers came with discipline, rifles, and authority. They came believing that numbers alone would decide the outcome. What they did not bring was understanding. They advanced in columns through a world that resisted them at every step. Water sources dried up before they arrived. Trails dissolved into stone. Heat crushed morale. Cold nights stripped strength from men already weakened by endless marshes. Horses stumbled and died. Supplies ran thin. Confidence eroded. Geronimo watched it all from a distance. He never confronted the army head-on. He did not need to. He let the land do its work. He moved his people through places where pursuit became punishment. He chose routes that forced soldiers to stretch their lines, to guess instead of know, to react instead of plan. Each escape humiliated the men tasked with capturing him. Each failure tightened the pressure from above. Reports demanded results. Newspapers demanded explanations. Politicians demanded closure. The empire could not accept that a small group of Apache, led by one man, could defy its reach for so long. Geronimo felt the pressure as well. Every mile walked came with the knowledge that the net was tightening. Each decision carried greater risk. He knew that mistakes would no longer be forgiven. The army had learned from its failures, just as he had learned from the land. Still, he refused to yield. Not because he believed victory was possible, but because surrender meant more than defeat. It meant the end of movement, the end of choice, the end of Apache life as he understood it. Reservations offered survival in name only, existence stripped of autonomy, tradition, and meaning. Geronimo chose uncertainty instead. As the pursuit intensified, the Apache moved like shadows between worlds, crossing borders that meant nothing to them, but everything to their pursuers. The line between the United States and Mexico offered temporary refuge, but it also narrowed options. Each escape made the next one harder. The army adapted. They coordinated across borders. They closed gaps. They learned the cost of underestimating the desert, and the man who understood it better than anyone alive. Geronimo watched his people suffer. Children grew thinner. Elders struggled to keep pace. Nights grew longer and colder. He carried the knowledge that every choice he made extended their hardship. And yet, when faced with the option to surrender, they looked to him, not for orders, but for reassurance. Geronimo never lied to them. He told them the truth, that freedom had become fragile, that the future was narrowing, that survival demanded more than courage. Still, he did not tell them to abandon the path they had chosen. He honored their resolve by continuing to lead. To the army, Geronimo became more than an enemy. He became an embarrassment, proof that control was incomplete, that power could be resisted by those who refused to conform. To his people, he remained a shield. When soldiers drew close, Geronimo split his group, drawing pursuit away from the most vulnerable. When the risk grew too great, he chose retreat over pride. He never sacrificed lives to preserve his legend. The irony was cruel. The very qualities that made him dangerous to the empire, restraint, patience, refusal to escalate, were the qualities that preserved his people. The chase stretched on, month after month. Men grew weary of riding an enemy they could not see. Officers grew frustrated by an opponent who refused to fight on expected terms. Every failure fed the myth surrounding Geronimo, turning him into something larger than life. Whispers spread through the ranks. Some spoke of him with anger, others with reluctant respect, a few with fear. How could a man with so little continue to defy so much? Geronimo did not ask that question. He knew the answer. He endured because he had to, because every step taken in freedom mattered, because every sunrise greeted without permission was a victory, however small, because to stop moving was to accept erasure. But even legends are bound by reality. As the pursuit reached its peak, as the empire committed everything it could without admitting failure, Geronimo understood that time itself was becoming the enemy. The land could no longer hide him forever. The people he protected were paying an unbearable price. Standing against an empire was never about winning. It was about proving that resistance was possible and that it would be remembered. Geronimo stood at the edge of that truth, watching the horizon narrow. To his people, he was still the last defender of Apache freedom. To the nation closing in around him, he was the most hunted man on the frontier. And soon, the choice he had delayed for so long would no longer be his alone. The empire was closing its fists, and the story of Geronimo was moving toward a moment that would define him forever, not on the battlefield, but in surrender. Geronimo knew long before the final moment arrived that this story would not end in triumph. The land had taught him many things, but it had never promised mercy. Seasons turned. Trails closed. The desert that once hid him now revealed how narrow the path ahead had become. His people were exhausted, bodies worn thin by years of flight, children growing up knowing only hunger and pursuit, elders carrying memories heavier than their steps. The empire had tightened its grip. The soldiers were closer now, better prepared, more patient. They moved not with panic, but with calculation. The frontier that once seemed endless had shrunk into corridors of survival that grew smaller each day. Geronimo understood what many of those who hunted him did not, that surrender was not the opposite of resistance. Sometimes it was its final expression. He did not fear death. He had lived beside it for too long. What he feared was watching his people disappear, not in battle, but in silence. When he finally agreed to meet the American officers, it was not because he believed their promises. It was because he believed his people deserved rest, food, a chance, however uncertain, to live another day. The surrender did not feel like an ending. There was no ceremony, no celebration, no sense of peace. Only fatigue. Only the quiet weight of a decision that could never be undone. Geronimo laid down his rifle, not as a defeated man, but as a man who had reached the edge of what resistance could ask of those who followed him. He did not kneel. He did not beg. He stood as he always had, aware, composed, unbroken in spirit, if not in circumstance. The promises came quickly. Safety, return to homeland, a future under protection. Words spoken with the confidence of authority. They did not last. Geronimo and his people were not welcomed into peace. They were taken as prisoners of war, loaded on the trains that carried them far from the lands that had shaped them. Florida, Alabama, Oklahoma, each place farther from the mountains, the deserts, the silence they knew. Freedom did not return with surrender. It vanished. Geronimo watched his people struggle to survive in a world stripped of meaning. Disease spread where the desert had once tempered weakness. Children forgot the paths their ancestors walked. Elders died staring at unfamiliar skies. The war was over, but its cost continued. In time, the nation that had hunted Geronimo discovered something unexpected. The man they had feared could now be displayed, paraded, framed as a relic of a conquered frontier. Geronimo was brought to fairs and exhibitions, asked to sign his name, photographed, admired and misunderstood in equal measure. To many Americans, he became a symbol of a wild past safely contained. To Geronimo, it was another form of captivity. He was no longer chased, but he was never free. In the final years of his life, Geronimo spoke little of regret, but one truth escaped him like a wound that never healed. He was reported to have said that surrender was his greatest mistake, not because it had failed him, but because it had changed nothing. The land was never returned, the freedom never restored, the promises never fulfilled. And yet, his story endured. Because surrender did not erase what came before it. Geronimo's resistance forced a nation to confront the limits of its power. It exposed the cost of expansion masked as destiny. It preserved, if only in memory, the truth that the Apache did not vanish quietly. To his people, Geronimo remained what he had always been, not a conqueror, not a king, but a man who stood when standing seemed impossible, a man who chose dignity over disappearance, a man who carried freedom as far as it could be carried. History would struggle to decide what to call him. To some, he was a threat. To others, a criminal. To many, a legend. But to the Apache, he was something far simpler and far more powerful. He was the last defender of their freedom. Not because he won, but because he refused to forget who they were. Geronimo died in 1909, far from the desert that raised him. His body failed him, as all bodies do. But his story did not die with him. It lingered in names spoken with anger or admiration, in debates about justice and conquest, in the unanswered question at the heart of the American frontier. Was he a hero, or was he hunted because he refused to stop being free? The answer depends on who is telling the story. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all. Geronimo did not ask to be remembered. He asked only that his people be allowed to live as themselves. History denied him that victory. But it could not deny him his place, because some men are not meant to win. They are meant to stand long enough for the world to notice. Call to action. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you question what freedom truly costs, leave a comment below and tell us how you see Geronimo, hero, outlaw, or something far more complex. Subscribe to Legends of the Wild West for more true frontier stories where history is not black and white and legends are forged in the gray spaces between. And if you believe stories like this still matter, share this episode, because memory is the last form of freedom no empire can take.